The winter air bit hard that December morning, 1942, at RAF Chelveston in England. Frost had painted everything white: the tarmac, the buildings, the aircraft. Colonel Curtis LeMay stood in the briefing room, studying the map with intense focus. That unlit cigar stayed clenched between his teeth, just where it always was. In a few hours, something revolutionary would take to the skies. 18 B-17 flying fortresses from his 305th Bombardment Group were about to attempt a mission that would fundamentally change air warfare forever. This wasn't just another bombing run. The real challenge was the formation itself, a configuration so tight, so precisely coordinated, that it would become the model for every heavy bomber group that followed. The target that day was Lille, France, but the true experiment happening in those 3 hours was something far more significant. What the crews didn't yet realize was that their mission would birth a defensive system so formidable that German fighter pilots would soon give it a name. When translated to English, it meant flying porcupine, a creature bristling with sharp spines pointing in every direction. The concept was deceptively simple but brutally effective. When you massed enough bombers together in the right formation, their machine gun fire created a wall so dense and overlapping that attacking it became essentially suicidal. The numbers told the story with cold mathematics. Each B-17G carried 13 50 caliber machine guns. Now imagine putting 54 of those bombers into a single combat box formation. That meant an attacking fighter pilot would find himself staring down the barrels of over 700 heavy machine guns, all capable of unleashing 750 rounds every single minute. Each round had an effective range of 3,500 feet. This was the combat box, and it would transform daylight bombing from a desperate gamble into America's most powerful weapon against Nazi Germany's war machine. But the path to this moment had been rough. Everything started on August 17, 1942, when the 8th Air Force flew its first bombing mission from England. 12 B-17E flying fortresses attacked the marshalling yards at Rouen-Sotteville in France, protected by RAF Spitfire's flying escort. The bombers flew in loose 6-plane squadrons with massive gaps between them, 2 to 4 miles of empty sky separating each squadron. This formation had been designed mainly to keep inexperienced crews from crashing into each other rather than to create any real defensive firepower. Within each squadron, bombers were stacked at 3 different altitudes, with about 150 feet between the highest and lowest aircraft. Everyone came back that day. Only 2 bombers sustained minor flak damage. Yet American air commanders understood that this shallow penetration into occupied France proved nothing. The real targets they needed to hit lay deep inside Germany itself, far beyond where any escort fighter could reach. The bombers would have to depend entirely on their own guns and formations. The challenge facing them was enormous. Strategic bombing doctrine demanded precision daylight attacks on specific industrial targets. Factories making aircraft parts, ball bearings, synthetic oil, and all the other materials Germany's military desperately needed. But reaching those targets meant flying hundreds of miles through airspace where German fighters hunted and anti-aircraft guns waited. From the bases in East Anglia, the distance to targets in central Germany stretched over 500 miles each way. At bomber cruising speeds of about 180 miles per hour, these missions ate up 8 to 10 hours. The entire time, crews sat at altitudes between 25 and 30,000 feet, where the temperature plummeted to 40 degrees below zero and oxygen was absolutely required to stay alive. Every breath came from a bottle. The B-17E that flew those early missions carried 950 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, a huge step forward from earlier models. 2 were mounted in a powered top turret right behind the cockpit. 2 more rotated in a powered belly turret, the revolutionary Sperry ball turret that could swivel a complete 360 degrees. 2 guns sat in the tail turret, manually operated but critical for defending the bomber's rear. Additional guns were positioned in the radio operator's compartment and in waist positions on either side of the rear fuselage, plus 1 flexible gun in the nose. The Browning M2 was a serious weapon, 64 pounds of steel, measuring 57 inches long, firing 750 rounds every minute with that 3,500-foot effective range. Notably, this was significantly longer range than the German 20mm MGF cannons initially used by Luftwaffe fighters. The physical punishment on B-17 gunners was savage. That bull turret gunner, almost always the smallest crew member, crawled through a hatch in the fuselage floor and then spent the entire mission crouched in a fetal position inside a space barely 4 feet in diameter. He couldn't wear a parachute, there simply wasn't room. If the bomber got hit and started going down, he had to rotate his turret to line up the hatch with the fuselage opening, exit into the bomber, find his parachute, and bail out. All of this while the aircraft might be spinning or burning around him. The waist gunners had it different but no easier. They stood at open windows while temperatures hit 40 below zero and winds screaming through the fuselage at 150 miles per hour. They wore electrically heated suits that constantly broke down. Frostbite was just something that happened. Guys lost fingers, toes, noses. Then in November 1942, a Luftwaffe fighter pilot named Egon Meyer made a discovery that would force the Americans to completely rethink everything. Meyer commanded the 3rd Group of Jagdgeschwader 2, and he'd spotted the bomber's most critical weakness. The nose of the aircraft, where the bombardier and navigator sat in that plexiglass enclosure, had only 2 manual 50 caliber machine guns defending it. Their fields of fire were extremely limited when attacking from ahead. Behind that nose sat the cockpit, where the pilot and co-pilot flew the aircraft. Kill the pilot at the controls, and the bomber would almost certainly go down, even if the rest of the crew survived. Meyer calculated that a head-on attack, though demanding exceptional skill and courage, would let German fighters concentrate their fire on the bomber's most vulnerable point. The attack had to come straight at 12 o'clock, directly ahead of the formation, with the German fighter screaming at full throttle straight toward the oncoming bombers. On November 23, 1942, flying alongside his wingman, Georg Peter Eider, Meyer shot down his first B-17 using this head-on attack. Within weeks, every Luftwaffe fighter pilot knew about it. By December 1942, head-on attacks had become the standard method for hitting American heavy bombers. The closing speed during a head-on attack was roughly 500 miles per hour. The B-17 cruised at about 180 miles per hour. A German FW-190 or Bf-109, attacking at full speed, approached at approximately 320 miles per hour. Add them together, and you got 500 miles per hour, or about 730 feet per second. A German pilot had perhaps 3 seconds from the moment he opened fire at maximum range until he absolutely had to break away to avoid a collision. 3 seconds. In that time, a skilled pilot could shred the B-17's nose and cockpit with 20mm cannon fire. He could kill the pilot and co-pilot. He could destroy the flight controls. He could turn a 4-engine bomber into falling wreckage, tumbling toward the Earth. This was the tactical problem Colonel Curtis LeMay needed to solve during the winter of 1942. LeMay was 36 years old, commanding the 305th Bombardment Group. He'd taken command on June 2, 1942, after spending the previous decade becoming arguably the finest navigator in the entire Air Corps. His navigation skills were legendary. Back in August 1937, flying as navigator under pilot and commander Caleb Haynes in a Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, he'd helped locate the battleship USS Utah during exercises off California, despite Navy personnel giving him completely wrong coordinates. In May 1938, LeMay navigated 3 B-17s across 620 nautical miles of open ocean to intercept the Italian liner SS Rex, approximately 725 miles off the American coast. The press covered the mission extensively and demonstrated both the B-17's capabilities and LeMay's extraordinary navigation abilities. By the time he took command of the 305th Bombardment Group, LeMay had developed firm ideas about how bombers should operate. First, precision bombing meant flying straight and level during the bomb run, no matter how heavy the flak was or how intense the fighter attacks became. The Norden bomb sight demanded stable flight to calculate the exact release point. Second, LeMay understood that tight formations were absolutely essential for concentrated defensive fire. Scattered bombers were dead bombers. Only by flying close together could crews mass their defensive armament to create overlapping zones of fire. Third, his men needed relentless training until every action became pure instinct. LeMay's crews found him demanding, unemotional, and utterly obsessed with mission success. He pushed them hard, and he led by example, flying the toughest missions himself. The existing formations simply weren't working. Those six-plane squadrons flying the early missions were too spread out to protect each other. At 2 to 4 miles separation, when bombers came under attack, they received no defensive fire support from other aircraft in their squadron. Their 50 caliber guns had that 3,500-foot effective range, just over half a mile. LeMay needed something tighter, something that would concentrate defensive fire while still allowing bombers to drop their payloads effectively and avoid colliding with each other. The first improvement came in October 1942, when the 8th Air Force adopted three-plane elements arranged in a V formation. This basic building block, 3 bombers flying in close formation with 1 lead plane and 2 wingmen, would remain standard throughout the war. But 3 planes weren't enough. The real breakthrough came in December 1942 with what LeMay called the Javelin Down formation. This 18-plane formation stacked bombers both vertically and horizontally, creating a pattern that resembled a spear point when you looked at it from the side. The formation consisted of 6 three-plane elements arranged into 3 squadrons. Each squadron had 2 elements. The squadrons themselves were stacked vertically with the lead squadron in the middle, the high squadron above and to one side, and the low squadron below and to the other side. The key innovation was stacking planes within each element and squadrons within the group downward in the direction of the sun. This helped gunners on higher aircraft see lower aircraft without being blinded by glare, while simultaneously creating overlapping fields of fire that covered every possible attack angle. The formation measured 600 feet from the lowest bomber to the highest, 500 feet from front to back, and nearly 2,500 feet across from one side to the other. Most importantly, every single bomber in the formation could bring its guns to bear on an attacking fighter from almost any direction. On December 6, 1942, the 305th Bomb Group flew the Javelin Down formation for the first time in actual combat during a mission to Lille, France. 18 B-17Fs took off from RAF Chelveston, climbed to altitude, and formed into the Javelin Down pattern. As they approached the target, German fighters made several passes but couldn't penetrate the concentrated defensive fire. The results were immediately obvious. German fighters that came at the formation found themselves facing concentrated fire from multiple bombers all at once. The interlocking fields of fire created zones where attacking fighters were exposed to guns from 3 or 4 B-17s simultaneously. The formation worked so well that the other 3 B-17 groups in England, the 91st, 303rd, and 306th Bomb Groups, immediately adopted it after mission debriefings revealed how effective it was. LeMay wasn't finished refining his idea. By January 1943, he'd improved the formation into a 21-plane wedge, adding a third 3-plane element to the most exposed squadron for extra protection. The most vulnerable position in the Javelin Down formation was the low squadron, which flew below and behind the lead squadron. German fighters had quickly learned to attack from below, coming up where their targets were silhouetted against the sky. Adding 3 additional bombers to the low squadron provided concentrated firepower exactly where the formation needed it most. This configuration was tested in combat, proved effective, and was formally adopted by all groups on January 13, 1943. It remained standard through September of that year. The bombers were stacked in a 3-dimensional array that looked like stairs when you viewed it from the front, a spear point from the side, and a diamond from above. Every plane had a specific position designated by squadron, element, and position number. The lead squadron consisted of 9 aircraft. The high squadron added 3 more bombers to the high right, and the low squadron added 9 more bombers to the low left for a total of 21 aircraft in the group formation. Every pilot knew exactly where he belonged. Maintaining that position was absolutely critical. A 1943 Army Air Forces survey found that just over half of all B-17s shot down by Germans during attacks on European targets were aircraft that had left the main formation. The discipline required to maintain position was extraordinary. Flying a B-17 in combat formation demanded constant attention and significant physical strength. The pilot had to maintain precise airspeed, altitude, and position relative to other aircraft while wearing heavy clothing, an oxygen mask, and flight gear at altitudes where temperatures reached 40 degrees below zero. The turbulence from the prop wash of leading bombers made formation flying even more grueling. Each B-17's 4 engines created massive vortices of disturbed air extending back hundreds of feet behind every bomber. Aircraft flying in trail or in lower positions encountered constant turbulence battering them around. The B-17's control system wasn't power-assisted. Moving the control yoke, rudder pedals and throttles required real physical force. After 6 hours in formation at altitude, a pilot's arms felt like concrete. The defensive effectiveness of the combat box became clear during missions in early 1943. On January 27, 1943, the 8th Air Force flew its first mission against a target inside Germany proper, attacking the naval yards at Wilhelmshaven. 53 B-17s and 20 B-24s were dispatched. The 305th Bomb Group participated, flying in the combat box formation LeMay had developed. German fighters intercepted the formations over the Frisian Islands and attacked with typical aggression. But the concentrated defensive fire from those tight formations forced them to break off their attacks earlier and made accurate shooting far more difficult. 3 bombers were lost from the entire force, a loss rate of just over 4%, far below the 20% losses that would happen on later unescorted deep penetration missions. But a critical vulnerability remained. Even with the combat box formation providing concentrated defensive fire from the sides, top, bottom, and rear, the head-on attack continued to prove devastatingly effective. Luftwaffe pilots refined their tactics throughout early 1943. Fighter units would position themselves ahead of the bomber stream, then set up their attack runs. They attacked in waves of 3 or 4 aircraft abreast, the Ket formation flying straight at the lead bomber formation. At 1,000 yards range, they opened fire with their 20mm cannons and 13mm machine guns. The FW-190 fighters carried 4 MG-151 20mm cannons plus 2 MG-17 machine guns in the later models. At 500 yards, the German pilots would fire a final burst and then execute violent breakaway maneuvers. Some pilots were so skilled and aggressive that they held their fire until 300 yards or closer, guaranteeing maximum effect. The Americans tried various solutions to this forward firepower problem. Some groups experimented with adding single manual 50 caliber guns in cheek mounts on each side of the nose, giving the navigator and bombardier additional weapons. The cheek guns helped cover some of the forward blind spot, but the fields of fire remained limited. The real breakthrough came with development of a remotely operated chin turret, mounting 250 caliber guns directly below the bombardier's position. The Bendix chin turret operated on electrical power and could be controlled by the gunner using a hand-operated mechanism while he peered through a reflector sight. This turret gave the B-17 genuine forward-firing capability, allowing it to track targets across a wide, sweeping arc that covered everything ahead of the nose. Starting in summer 1943, the B-17G began rolling off assembly lines with this chin turret already installed as standard equipment. This ultimate version of the Flying Fortress packed 13 50 caliber machine guns, making it the most heavily gunned bomber in the entire American arsenal. The guns were spread across 5 powered rotating turrets and 4 manually operated positions. The Bendix chin turret alone mounted 2 guns that specifically defended against head-on fighter attacks. 2 additional cheek guns sat in manual ball socket mounts positioned on either side of the nose, providing supplementary coverage from the front. 2 more guns occupied the dorsal turret perched just behind the cockpit, where the flight engineer operated them to counter threats from above and the sides. 2 guns in the Sperry ball turret nestled in the belly of the fuselage provided defense against attacks coming from below. The waist positions, 1 on each side of the rear fuselage, each held 1 manually operated gun to protect the beam areas. 1 flexible gun in the radio operator's compartment offered additional protection from above and behind. Finally, 2 guns in the tail turret provided critical rear defense. Those tail guns commanded the longest effective firing range of any defensive position, reaching roughly 1,000 yards directly behind the bomber. The B-17G at last delivered truly comprehensive defensive coverage in every direction. 10 men made up the crew that operated this machine. The pilot served as commander, making all critical decisions and leading the crew through every stage of the mission. The co-pilot handled secondary flying responsibilities, monitored the engines, managed fuel consumption, and stood ready to take control if the pilot became unable to fly. Navigation responsibilities fell to the navigator, who plotted the course and guided the formation to its target. The bombardier controlled the nose turret during the bombing run and operated the Bendix chin turret before and after bombs away. The flight engineer constantly watched engine performance, tracked fuel consumption, monitored hydraulic pressures and electrical systems, and manned the dorsal turret throughout the mission. The radio operator handled all communications with base and other aircraft, while also manning the radio compartment gun. The ball turret gunner spent virtually his entire mission squeezed inside the cramped spherical turret hanging beneath the aircraft. The two waist gunners stood at open windows, positioned along either side of the fuselage's rear section. The tail gunner worked alone in his isolated position, lying in a prone posture behind his guns for hours on end, maintaining constant vigilance against threats approaching from behind. The Luftwaffe responded to these improved American defenses by building more powerful fighter weapons and creating new attack strategies. When engineers examined the wreckage of downed B-17s, they calculated that destroying a heavy bomber by attacking from behind required roughly 20 hits from 20mm cannon shells. Gun camera footage from actual combat showed that average fighter pilots hit their targets with only about 2% of the rounds they fired during rear attacks. The mathematics were devastating. To score 20 hits, an average pilot would need to fire about 1,000 rounds. Yet the early Focke-Wulf 190 carried only 500 rounds of 20mm ammunition in total. Even firing every single round meant only roughly 10 hits on average, which fell short of what was needed to guarantee a kill. The answer lay in bigger, more destructive weapons. Later FW-190 variants mounted 4 or even 6 MG-151 20mm cannons, supplemented by twin MG-131 13mm heavy machine guns. Certain aircraft received experimental heavy cannon installations. The Mk-37 represented a 37mm automatic cannon. The Mk-133 featured a 30mm design. Some specialized bomber hunter aircraft carried weapons even larger and more powerful. These massive cannons could tear apart a bomber with just 1 or 2 solid impacts, though aiming them proved extremely difficult. They added considerable weight, reduced aircraft performance, and carried very limited ammunition loads. The Luftwaffe also pursued unguided rocket projectiles as another option. The Werfer Granit 21 consisted of a 21-centimeter rocket housed in basic tube launchers mounted beneath the wings. The WGR-21 carried enormous destructive force in its warhead. A direct strike would obliterate a B-17, but employing these weapons presented substantial challenges. The rockets featured terrible ballistic characteristics and possessed no guidance capability whatsoever. Pilots had to launch them from ranges of 800 to 1,000 yards, distances beyond where bomber guns could effectively respond. Success rates remained extremely low, yet the rockets served a powerful psychological purpose. When bomber crews spotted large rockets trailing smoke streaking toward their formation, they instinctively took evasive action, scattering the tight groupings and throwing off the synchronized bomb run. Throughout 1943, as the 8th Air Force swelled in numbers, the combat box arrangement transformed to handle these expanded formations. By spring 1943, the 8th had grown to include 16 groups of B-17s, plus 4 groups of B-24 Liberators. Bombing missions now involved 100 to 200 aircraft. The standard group formation containing 18 to 21 planes was expanded upward to create combat wing configurations. 3 separate groups flying in close proximity, stacked both vertically and horizontally, produced a 54-plane wall of bombers that could unleash truly devastating defensive firepower. This wing box structure became the standard arrangement for major operations from early 1943 through May 1944. The 3 groups occupied specific positions, with a lead group anchoring the center. a high group positioned above and to one side, and a low group placed below and to the opposite side. The entire wing box occupied approximately 3,000 feet of vertical space, 700 feet of depth, and 2,000 feet of width. The 54-plane combat wing could bring to bear upwards of 700 heavy-caliber defensive machine guns when equipped with B-17Gs. 54 bombers, each fitted with 13 guns, meant 700 total heavy machine guns concentrated in one formation. A German fighter pilot approaching such a formation faced the grim reality that dozens of gunners possessed him in their sights, while hundreds of bullets converged on his incoming path. The tracer ammunition, with every fifth round glowing, created visible streams of fire cutting through the sky. From a distance, the formations resembled massive porcupines bristling with fire spines extending outward in all directions. German fighter pilots began calling the B-17 combat box formations Fliegerabwehr or Stachelschwein, flying porcupines, a term that perfectly captured both the visual appearance and the tactical nightmare of attacking massed bombers. Oberleutnant Heinz Knoke, a Luftwaffe fighter ace, credited with 33 confirmed victories while flying with Jagdgeschwader 11, recorded his experience in combat logs. "Attacking the American bombers resembles flying into a wall of fire," he wrote. "The tracer streams arrive from every direction imaginable. You select your target, position yourself for the approach, and suddenly the entire sky around you erupts with red fire. You trigger your guns, struggle to land solid hits on the bomber, and then you dive away, hoping that nothing essential absorbed damage." Major Anton Haeckel, who finished the war with 195 confirmed victories, explained the tactical challenge differently. Coming from behind meant a lengthy period, closing from 1,000 meters down to our 400-meter firing range, when the bombers were hitting us, but we could not effectively shoot back. The American 50 caliber guns had superior range compared to our weapons. Frontal attacks proved more favorable because the closing speed was so extreme that we spent less time in their firing envelope. However, those front assaults demanded considerably more skill and courage. The rigid formation discipline that the combat box demanded created one critical weakness that seemed impossible to overcome. Individual bombers could not perform evasive maneuvers while in formation. They had to maintain straight and level flight, holding their exact position regardless of flak or fighter assaults. This inflexibility made the formations extremely vulnerable to German anti-aircraft guns. The Luftwaffe's flak organization eventually expanded to over 1 million personnel, operating thousands of heavy anti-aircraft guns. The primary German heavy flak weapon was the famous 8.8 centimeter flak, the 18, 36, 37, and 41 series models, which fired 8.8 kilogram high-explosive projectiles to altitudes exceeding 30,000 feet. These guns were positioned in defensive batteries surrounding critical targets. When bomber formations approached, the flak batteries would calculate the formation's position 30 seconds into the future and fill that space with bursting shells. Flak caused 40% of all wounds sustained by 8th Air Force personnel, exceeding the percentage from fighter attacks. The real examination of the combat box formation occurred during the deep penetration missions of August and October 1943. These operations pushed American bombing strategy to its limits and exposed both the formation's defensive strengths and its fatal vulnerability when operating without fighter protection. On August 17, 1943, marking exactly 1 year since the 8th Air Force's inaugural mission, 376 B-17s launched a coordinated double strike against the Messerschmitt aircraft factory at Regensburg and the ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt. This represented the largest and most ambitious American bombing campaign yet attempted. Curtis LeMay, commanding the 3rd Air Division, would personally lead the Regensburg strike. The Regensburg force, comprising 146 B-17s from 7 bomb groups, would hit the target first, then continue south across the Alps toward bases in North Africa. The Schweinfurt force, made up of 230 B-17s from 9 groups, would follow behind and return to England. Trouble emerged from the start. Heavy fog blanketed English airfields, forcing delays that opened a 3-hour gap between strikes instead of the planned 30 minutes. This gap destroyed the entire tactical strategy. German radar detected both formations immediately after takeoff. The extended delay provided German fighter controllers time to land their aircraft, rearm them, refuel, and launch attacks against both bomber streams. The Regensburg force ran into German fighters almost immediately upon crossing the Dutch coastline. Bf-109s and Fw-190s came at them in successive waves. Head-on attacks arrived first, with 3 and 4 fighters abreast diving straight toward the lead bombers. The formations pressed onward despite the onslaught. Over Regensburg, the bombing proved accurate, and the Messerschmitt facility sustained heavy damage, yet the cost extracted was severe. 24 B-17s went down. The Schweinfurt force experienced considerably worse outcomes. Delayed by hours, they encountered German fighters that had already attacked the Regensburg force, returned to their airfields, rearmed themselves, and taken off once more. The Schweinfurt force lost 36 B-17s from the 183 that reached the target. Combined losses that day totaled 60 bombers and approximately 600 airmen, a casualty rate of 20%. Despite these catastrophic losses, the combat box formations performed precisely as they had been designed. Following the mission, USAF analysts surveyed the damage patterns and determined that more than half the bombers that were shot down had separated from the main formation's protection. Aircraft that became detached from the group because of battle damage, mechanical problems, or aircrew mistakes were rapidly overwhelmed by German fighters. Once cut off from the formation's defensive firepower, a B-17 typically lasted less than 5 minutes before being shot down. By contrast, bombers that maintained strict formation discipline and remained in their assigned slots demonstrated substantially higher survival rates. The defensive fire forced German pilots to break off sooner, made precise gunnery nearly impossible, and occasionally brought down attacking fighters. These missions revealed both the combat box's effectiveness and its inherent limitations. The formations could defend themselves capably enough to penetrate deep into German territory and inflict heavy losses on attacking fighters. But without dedicated fighter escort to keep German fighters at bay, losses became catastrophic and impossible to sustain. The fundamental problem was that no long-range escort fighter existed in August 1943. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt possessed the speed and altitude capability to match German fighters in direct combat, but its operational range was severely restricted. Flying on internal fuel alone, the P-47 could accompany bombers only to approximately 125 miles from base. Adding external 75-gallon drop tanks, introduced in August 1943, extended this to 230 miles. With 108-gallon drop tanks arriving in September 1943, the range reached 275 miles. This proved sufficient for missions targeting the Low Countries, northern France and western Germany, but fell drastically short for deep penetrations toward central Germany. Pending the arrival of true long-range escorts, the 8th Air Force continued optimizing the combat box formation to extract maximum defensive advantage. In September 1943, engineers tested a new arrangement using a 36-plane group configuration. This design doubled the number of 3 plane elements within each squadron, while positioning all 3 aircraft at identical altitude to eliminate collision hazards. The result was a tighter formation that required less effort to maintain and concentrated the bomb loads more effectively. By late 1943, group commanders could select between the 21-plane compact arrangement for smaller operations, the 36-plane group formation for improved bombing precision, or the 54-plane wing configuration for maximum defensive punch. The ultimate test occurred on October 14, 1943, when the 8th Air Force made another attempt on Schweinfurt to finish destroying the ball-bearing industry. History would call this mission Black Thursday, the deadliest day in 8th Air Force history. 291 B-17s departed that morning from air bases scattered across East Anglia. Weather conditions proved miserable, and assembly of the formations consumed more time than anticipated. The mission came close to cancellation, but leadership chose to proceed. The strategic value of eliminating Schweinfurt's ball-bearing output justified the gamble. Only roughly half the anticipated P-47 escort fighters managed to rendezvous with the bomber formations. As the B-17s in their combat box formations neared Aachen on the Belgian-German frontier, The Thunderbolt pilots waggled their wings in the customary farewell and turned back toward England, their fuel reserves depleted. The bombers continued forward into Germany alone. Then the Luftwaffe unleashed overwhelming force. German fighter controllers had monitored the formations since departure. Every available fighter unit stationed across Western Germany received scramble orders. More than 300 German fighters struck the bomber stream in coordinated assaults. Single-engine Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s came at them 3 and 4 abreast, diving head-on. The attacks came with tremendous ferocity and determination. Twin-engine fighters followed, firing WGR-21 rockets from 1,000 yards away. The enormous rockets terrified formations into breaking apart as individual B-17s tried evasive maneuvers. This shattered the combat boxes and eliminated the mutual defensive protection. The Luftwaffe had studied past engagements and refined their attack approaches specifically to destroy the combat box formation structure. They concentrated assaults on individual groups, overwhelming the localized defensive capabilities. Any bomber that suffered damage and fell away from the group was immediately surrounded by German fighters. German pilots operated from home bases within Germany, numerous airfields positioned just 50 miles away from the bomber route. Many pilots flew multiple missions that day, landing, rearming, refueling, and launching again before the bombers departed German airspace. The bombers faced an endless succession of fresh, determined fighters. Once their ammunition ran out, the fighters would descend to their bases, take on fuel and fresh loads in just 15 to 20 minutes, then climb back into the sky to make another pass at the same bomber stream. They'd do this again and again, pressing attack after attack. By the time the formations reached their designated points, 28 bombers had already fallen from the sky. The 305th Bomb Group, the unit where LeMay had served before, took a particularly devastating blow. Positioned in the most vulnerable slot in the formation, the low group bore the full weight of wave after wave of fighter attacks. 13 aircraft from the 305th never came home to England, making it the hardest hit group of the entire day. 130 men from that unit were killed, captured, or simply vanished, their fates unknown. The loss was staggering, yet despite everything the Germans threw at them, the bombing itself proved remarkably accurate. When reconnaissance planes photographed the target the next day, the damage was obvious and severe. Multiple production facilities lay in ruins, but the price paid for those results was something American commanders had never witnessed before. Out of the 291 B-17s that left England that morning, 60 never returned, brought down by flak or fighters. Another 17 limped back so badly damaged they had to be torn apart for scrap metal. 121 more touched down with varying degrees of damage scattered across their fuselages and wings. The numbers told a stark story. The losses represented more than a quarter of the entire attacking force. The human toll was equally grim. 650 airmen didn't come home out of the 2,900 who flew that day. That meant nearly 1 in every 5 crews would never see their families again. At casualty rates like that, an airman's chances of flying 25 missions and surviving were virtually non-existent. Staff Sergeant Harold Monroe Graham flew as the ball turret gunner with the 305th Bomb Group. He'd already completed 27 missions without getting killed, which made him one of the fortunate few. The night before this terrible day, he wrote a letter home, one his family would keep for decades. He wrote that they all knew what lay ahead. Schweinfurt was the toughest target in all of Germany, he said, but the formation would protect them as much as anything could. If they stayed together, if they held the box, no matter what happened, some of them would make it through. The formation was their only real chance. The next day, Graham's bomber took multiple direct hits over Schweinfurt. The aircraft caught fire, twisted into a spin, and started falling. Only 3 men managed to bail out. Graham wasn't one of them. He was just 22 years old. When military analysts reviewed what happened that day, they discovered something important. Bombers that maintained their position in the formation survived far more often than those that broke away or fell out of line. Crews that held their spots had better than half a chance of making it home. Those that scattered, those that fell out and tried to save themselves individually, almost never made it. The box protected them. The concentrated machine gun fire from all those bombers had also taken a toll on the German fighters. Some were shot down outright, many more were damaged. Most importantly, the wall of defensive fire forced German pilots to break off their attacks sooner than they wanted. Without that formation, without all those guns creating overlapping fields of fire, the losses would have been even worse. The formation did what it was designed to do, but it simply wasn't enough without long-range fighters flying alongside them. The mission's aftermath forced American military leadership to rethink everything about daylight bombing strategy. The casualty rates were unsustainable. They couldn't ask crews to fly 25 missions when every single mission meant a 1 in 5 chance of not returning. For the rest of that year, the 8th Air Force only sent bombers to targets that could be reached by fighter escort and back again. Long-range missions deep into Germany were called off indefinitely. But this wasn't surrender. It was a necessary pause while the military worked on the answer to its most pressing problem. That solution came from North American aviation. By late 1943, the P-51B Mustang was arriving at English bases. This fighter had something no other fighter had: range. Powered by a Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin engine and fitted with drop tanks under the wings, the P-51B could fly over 650 miles from its base, far enough to escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back again. Nothing the Germans had could match this, and it wasn't just range. The Mustang could fight too. At 30,000 feet, where bombers and German fighters tangled, the P-51B could hold its own against the Bf-109 and FW-190. When fighter groups equipped with these Mustangs started escorting bomber formations in early 1944, everything changed. The advantage swung decisively toward the Allies. The combat boxes stayed in use for the rest of the war, but their role shifted. With long-range escorts now providing real protection, the tight formations weren't as critical just for keeping planes alive. Instead, they became important for something else: making sure the bombs hit what the crews were aiming at. When bombers flew in tight formation, their bombs came down in concentrated patterns that did maximum damage to factories and refineries. As the Luftwaffe threat diminished through 1944, German flak became the main killer instead of fighters. The 36-plane group formation, smaller and easier to maintain than the massive 54-plane wing boxes, became standard for most missions starting in May of that year. By February 1944, when the 8th Air Force went back to Schweinfurt during the Big Week missions, the situation looked completely different. Mustangs with their long-range tanks flew all the way to the target and stayed with the bombers on the way out. The B-17G, the newest model, carried 13 machine guns, giving crews comprehensive defensive coverage from nearly every angle. The combat boxes themselves had been refined through 2 years of combat experience and constant adjustment. More importantly, the Luftwaffe was starting to collapse under the weight of sustained losses. German fighter losses were becoming impossible to replace. Experienced pilots were dying faster than they could be trained. The strategic bombing campaign that had seemed ready to fail in October 1943 was actually succeeding. By the time the invasion came on June 6, 1944, Allied air forces owned the skies over Europe completely. German fighters had been systematically eliminated through constant attrition. Bomber formations could operate over most of Germany with relative safety now. Casualties dropped from 1 in 5 in October 1943 down to 3 to 5% by mid-1944. That was a rate crews could actually survive. Airmen's chances of completing their tour improved dramatically. The psychological impact was enormous. New crews arriving in theater could see combat veterans who had finished their 25 missions. Veterans who were still alive. That meant it could be done. That meant you might actually make it home. The numbers demonstrated just how powerful the combat box really was. American factories built 12,731 B-17s during the war. 4,735 were lost in combat, which works out to a loss rate of 37% overall. But when you dug into the detailed statistics, something clear emerged. Bombers that maintained formation discipline had survival rates well above that average. Bombers that became separated had survival rates far below. A bomber that fell out of formation had maybe a 20% chance of reaching friendly territory. Most were shot down within minutes, surrounded by fighters. A bomber that held its position had better than 50% chance of survival even when the opposition was fierce. The difference between living and dying often came down to nothing more than holding your place in that formation. One radio operator, Sergeant Albert Brown, flying with the 305th Bomb Group, wrote a letter home that was eventually donated to the National Air Force Museum. He wrote that the formation was everything. You could watch a bomber fall out and know immediately it was done for. Fighters would swarm it like sharks smelling blood in water. But if you stayed in the box, if you held your position and did your job, the other bombers would protect you with their guns and you'd protect them with yours. That was the only way any of them survived, by depending on each other absolutely. That's what carried you through. Knowing you weren't alone, knowing that if you did your part and stayed in position, the formation would give you the best chance anything could give you in a war like this. The costs were absolutely horrific, and people need to understand that honestly. The 8th Air Force suffered 54,000 casualties over the entire bombing campaign. 26,000 were killed in action. 28,000 became prisoners of war. To understand how massive that was, consider that the 8th Air Force lost more men than the entire Marine Corps lost fighting across the Pacific. The worst came during the second half of 1943, when bombers had to fly deep into Germany without adequate fighter protection. Those missions produced casualty rates that simply could not be sustained. The courage it took to climb into those bombers, knowing the odds were against survival, to fly through exploding flak and fighter attacks, to stay in formation when every nerve screamed at you to break away and save yourself. That kind of courage cannot be exaggerated. The mathematics of the combat box were brutal and exact. A 54-plane combat wing of B-17s carried more than 700 heavy machine guns. Each gun could fire 750 rounds every minute. Each had an effective range of 3,500 feet. These guns were positioned and angled so their fields of fire overlapped in 3 dimensions, creating a complete protective shell around the formation. Any fighter that tried to attack that formation had to fly through seconds of concentrated fire from multiple directions. German pilots who studied what happened to their comrades knew attacking an intact formation was extraordinarily dangerous. That defensive fire forced them to break off their attacks early, before they could aim properly at the bombers. Sometimes it shot them down outright. The combat box represented something uniquely American about how that nation made war. It combined engineering skill, massive industrial capacity, and tactical innovation in a way no other country could match. When other nations discovered the horrific costs of daylight bombing, they quit. The Americans didn't quit. They built a solution. They studied the problem systematically. They looked at which formations lost fewer aircraft. They tested different arrangements. They refined their tactics based on what they learned in actual combat. The solution demanded enormous industrial power. Building thousands of heavy bombers, each one carrying 13 machine guns and 7,500 rounds of ammunition, required millions of hours of labor coordinated across dozens of states. The solution also meant building a massive training system to teach tens of thousands of pilots, navigators, bombardiers, and gunners how to work as a single coordinated team. Getting all those crews trained, transported, and ready for combat operations presented an organizational challenge as difficult as the fighting itself. The combat box wasn't just a tactical formation, it was a physical expression of American organizational ability and industrial strength. It showed how technological advantages and organizational skill could overcome tactical problems. Germany had better trained pilots at the start and the advantage of fighting above their own territory. But Germany couldn't match American production capacity or the American ability to coordinate massive operations involving thousands of aircraft. The combat box symbolized this fundamental advantage. Only a nation with the industrial power to build thousands of bombers and the organizational capability to coordinate them in complex formations could execute this strategy successfully. When Curtis LeMay first tested this formation over Laval on December 6, 1942, he was experimenting with a theoretical solution to a practical problem. He'd studied the defensive weaknesses of looser formations. He'd calculated the fields of fire for different gun positions. He'd designed a formation that made those overlapping coverage zones work together. Less than 3 years later, when the war ended in May 1945, the combat box had become the standard against which all bomber formations were measured. Over 12,000 B-17s flew combat missions using variations of this formation. They dropped more than 640,000 tons of bombs on German targets. They destroyed factories, refineries, railroad yards, and military installations. They forced the Luftwaffe into a war of attrition Germany couldn't win. They proved conclusively that daylight strategic bombing could succeed even against determined opposition, provided you had the right tactics, enough firepower, and exceptionally skilled air crews. The men who climbed into those formations knew exactly what they were doing. They understood the risks. Intelligence officers showed them loss statistics before every mission. They counted the empty beds in the barracks. They attended funerals for friends they'd flown with. They knew that finishing a 25-mission tour required skill, yes, and courage, absolutely, but also a tremendous amount of luck. The rituals before each mission reflected this understanding. Some men wrote letters to their families to be mailed if they didn't come back. Others prayed silently. Some carried lucky charms in their pockets. They put on their equipment with care and attention to detail. They ran through equipment checks methodically. Then they walked to their aircraft with quiet resolution, like men undertaking work that simply had to be done regardless of what it might cost. The historical importance of the combat box goes beyond just how well it worked tactically. It represented a fundamental choice about air power strategy. The Army Air Forces had committed to daylight precision bombing against heavily defended targets. This strategy seemed crazy when the British had already given up on daylight bombing because losses were too high. But the Americans stuck with the plan. They believed destroying specific industrial targets was essential to winning the war. They believed only daylight bombing could provide the accuracy needed to hit those specific targets. The combat box was the tactical solution that made daylight precision bombing actually work. It concentrated enough firepower in enough places that German fighters couldn't easily break through. The formations demanded incredible skill from the pilots, extraordinary physical stamina from everyone aboard, and profound courage from men enduring sub-zero temperatures, fighter attacks, and explosions from flak for 8 to 10 hours at a stretch. Yet thousands of crews did this multiple times. Many continued flying even after completing their required tours, driven by the belief they were shortening the war and saving lives. In the entire history of aerial combat, few tactical innovations have mattered more or required greater sacrifice from the men executing them. The combat box remains a testament to both American creativity in solving difficult problems and the extraordinary bravery of young men flying tight formation through walls of fire above Nazi Europe. These were young men, averaging just 23 years old, many fresh from farms and small towns scattered across America. Day after day, they climbed into those bombers and faced odds that would have broken professional soldiers. They did it because they believed in what they were doing. They believed they were fighting tyranny, defending freedom, protecting their families and everything they held dear. That belief carried them through experiences that left many of them damaged in ways that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. The combat box formations showcase what ordinary Americans can achieve when duty calls them to do extraordinary things. They represent one of the most innovative and consequential tactical developments in modern military aviation. It was accomplished not through brute force alone, but through the combination of American industrial capacity, organizational excellence, and the steely determination of young men who refused to accept defeat.